My name is Akhenaton Andrew Dafir Jones III, and today I would like to welcome you all to the second annual Personal Branding Workshop. This is an event hosted by the MIT Black Graduate Student Association and the Academy of Courageous Minority Engineers. So this workshop is really about branding. If you don't craft your brand, others are going to craft it for you. Or worse, you're not going to exist. So one of the problems with that is, well, let's say that you are a very successful drug. You're really useful in curing the world, but you don't have a brand. Then people wind up being afraid of you. People wind up not going and reaching out to this drug, which could potentially cure their lives, and it turns out that it endangers their lives and others. That's what happens when you don't have a brand. That's what happened with the measles vaccine. That was something that didn't have a brand. It didn't seem to need a brand. And in turn, we wind up getting a minor outbreak of measles. So we are here today to really introduce the idea of branding. Today's personal branding workshop focuses on technology, society, and me. The panelists will be addressing things on how they leverage existing technology to really sell their brand. They will be addressing how they convinced a skeptical public that the time was now, that they were the ones that we had been waiting for, and that they were the agents of change to do it. We will take 15 minutes for the panel members to talk about the idea of technology, society, and me. And after that, we'll have 45 minutes of question and answers where you can ask them your burning questions about branding and about the ideas that you might have. At lunch, we invite you to visit our sponsors tables. Right now we have Akamai, the Boston Fed, and iTrek, and all of them are both looking to potentially help you with your brand as well as help you introduce you to their brand. And when you go up to those tables, if you go up to all three of them, we will enter you into a raffle. If you're over the age of 21, that raffle will get you wine. If you are under the age of 21, that raffle will get you t-shirts and notebooks, if you win. All right? So, cool things to go. That's a very decent incentive to actually go out and check out the tables other than the things that they'll be presenting. Following lunch, we're going to have a strategy and development session. The strategy and development session is actually intended to take you from what you're going to learn from the panelists to an idea, to generating your own ideas and to generating your own brand. Today, we're going to have a chance to listen and ask questions from people who have been to the point where you want to go and who are going there. So, the following intros are brief and by no means a complete picture. They are a mere snapshot taken from the biographies on our website. These are intended to give taste without the full main course. The snapshots were not pre-approved, but hopefully their brand is strong enough to withstand the dilution. Not that they have a chance to correct me right now. All right? Cool. That's my disclaimer. That's part of it. So, let's see. Sarah Haig is the COO and co-founder of Silverside Detectors. She is coming from a background of international security and economic development. She leverages this expertise to help Silverside grow and connect to the international policy regarding nuclear threat reductions. W. Cecil Hobbs is a business development executive. He has worked with high-growth companies, early-stage ventures, and new business units within very large enterprises across a number of tech-driven sectors. So I would like us all to welcome our two panelists. I guess we can start with you, Sarah.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. And my co-founder, Andrew Inglis, was originally supposed to be on this panel. He is sick, and he sends his regrets and regards and greetings and everything else. Do check out his bio on the website, and if you want to connect with him, get my card and then go talk to him. And you can also complain to him about any way I misrepresent Silverside Detectors today. My comments are going to be shaped around branding a startup, and I hope this will be a little bit of a different trajectory than the rest of the speakers, and I hope this prompts a lot of questions from all of you. When you have a startup, you have no track record, you have no product technology initially. Your brand is going to be your people, and with Silverside Detectors, that was Andrew Inglis and me. And the fundamental core of what we're doing is shaping a message of who we are and of what's true. Not what we want to be true, not what will be true, but what is true and what's core. So the first step in doing that is super simple. It's knowing who you are. When your company is two people, who you are is the overlap of the Venn diagram of your personality, your motivation, and your work ethic. And that communicated out is then going to represent the company and what you're building. For us, Andrew Inglis was a postdoc, a physics postdoc at Boston University, was working on nuclear detection technology. And he was fundamentally motivated by presenting technology that solved the problem of nuclear terrorism. That sounds like a big thing, so actually it's really solving one tiny corner of the risk profile of cities and nuclear terrorism, but we speak in big visionary language because that's what startups have to do. He was motivated as a scientist of taking something that worked in the lab and making that benefit you and me and my mom and your grandmother, anybody who is in a large city that might be on the radar screen for terrorists with nuclear material. I came from an international security background. I'm happy to describe a little bit more about what that is and how personally I brand myself as a generalist in a technical world. But I had just come out of the Kennedy School at Harvard with an international security background, and I was really, really tired of talking. Policy is the statement of what should happen, and I don't want to talk about shoulds. I want to actually move the needle and do something, no matter how small that is. So Andrew and I connected just through a mutual friend. A friend of mine at church one day said, "Sarah, you're in international security. My friend is making nuclear bomb detectors. You guys should connect." And we did. And what we found, and this is the core of Silverside, was that we are both really motivated to change the threat profile of the US cities, international cities, with regard to nuclear material. And that became the core of our company. Andrew's a physicist. He thinks deeply about problems. I'm a generalist. I will think broadly before I go deep. We talk differently. We communicate differently. We problem solve differently. We interact with lawyers, advisors, mentors, you name it, differently. And what's emerged in I guess you would say the brand of our company is this overlapping core of what we are fundamentally about, and then how that is expressed can meet any different audience. And that's a strength that I think we underestimated when we started the company. Because the second part of shaping your brand is knowing your audience. A brand is going to represent what's fundamentally true about you, and yet what matters at the end is not what you're saying, but what somebody else is hearing. And so you have to understand the vocabulary, the incentives, and the motivation of the people to whom you're speaking. Now, if you have a commercial product, a kind of that you're, add to cart on Amazon or something, you're going to know your target market. You're going to be able to shape your brand towards that. When you're Silverside Detectors and you are, 6 months old, 12 months old, and you are in the startup world in Boston, so trying to figure out how you connect with that. You are trying to get research funding from the government, so you're looking at R&D agencies. You're trying to get end user feedback on your product, so you're looking at, for us, everybody from the Massachusetts National Guard to the Coast Guard to the police. And then we're also trying to communicate to the policy space. That's at least 4 different audiences with fundamentally different vocabulary, incentives, and motivation. So one of the things that we are actively figuring out, how do you brand yourself, represent that fundamental truth of who you are, and make that accessible and connectable with kind of like a 360-degree circle of people with whom you want to engage. The key, so coming back to the first of those 3 points that I mentioned, the vocabulary. What is the language that people use in that space? And I was just telling Marina at the beginning of this day, one of my pet peeves is how all of us, I think especially in academia, use insider language to establish our credentials. And doing that often use insider language and vocabulary to push people out, to prove that I know more than you do about this. I'm an expert and you're an outsider, establishing a power hierarchy through our words. That's great when you want to get the applause of a professor. That's not great when you want to represent your company or yourself to an audience and engage them. So understanding the vocabulary of VCs means going on to their into their territory, taking their words and understanding how that matches to your space, understanding, and then taking what we're doing and matching it to them. My goal fundamentally is for my grandmother to understand exactly what we're doing. My grandmother was a smart woman. She knows nothing about physics. She knows nothing about international security. And I want her to feel like an insider to what Silverside Detectors is doing. I want DARPA, who's our government funder right now, to understand. Obviously, they're going to understand technically what they're doing. I want them also to understand why we're doing it. They couldn't care less about us being a startup in Boston and all that means. They couldn't care less about Andrew's and my desire to change the world and to interrupt the entire military-industrial complex and blah, 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 blah. They couldn't care less. And yet, we need to represent those core elements of who we are in vocabulary that they do care about. When we're talking to end users, this is my favorite acronym I've ever heard, the Massachusetts, well, not the acronym, the name, the Massachusetts National Guard Weapons of Mass Destruction Civil Support Team. This is actually a true agency. During the Head of the Charles Regatta, the National Guard has some people that are out on the banks of the Charles River with radiation detectors on their backpacks or on their belts, walking around trying to take readings of background gamma ray and background neutron activity on the Charles River, looking for nuclear material that might blow up the 300,000 people that are watching this event. When we went to work with the Massachusetts National Guard Weapons of Mass Destruction Civil Support Team, and I just say that because it cracks me up, and if you had a t-shirt, it would wrap all the way around the chest. We're talking to them about who we are, what we're doing. They just care about the technology. What does this do? How does this compare to what I know? They're impressed. You're a startup, great. That sounds like Google. And we're like, okay, fine. The federal government is funding you. Okay, great. We don't really like the federal government to care about them or whatever. They want to know, how does your technology work, and how does that impact our responsibilities in our day-to-day keeping you safe? So we have to represent who we are and what we're doing in that tech-focused way, and yet still not incorporate everything else in that, because that's who we are. And then finally, in the policy space, this is really core to Silverside Detectors, and this is why I'm a part of the team. It's all well and good to say there's a threat of nuclear terrorism out there. We have technology that's better. It's going to solve it. And then start comparing yourself against every other product on the market. I don't care about products that are on the market right now. I care about what are the solutions that every single agency is thinking about 5, 10, 20 years from now. And I want to be able to come back to the market and say, what you're using doesn't solve the problems of the next decade, the problems of tomorrow. And in doing that, when you go to the government, their responsibility is to get things done yesterday. And they don't have the bandwidth, and often they're not the people that are skilled in thinking long-term strategically. It's just a mismatch between what they're incentivized to do. So you go to think tanks, because think tanks are the people that are thinking long-term. They're the ones that are influencing the kind of political appointees higher up in the government, and that translates and trickles down to the get it done tomorrow agendas of the doers in the various agencies. When we go to talk to a think tank, or when I go to talk to a think tank in DC, I'm going to go back to all my Kennedy School vocabulary and all of that stuff. And yet, I also have to pull in, why does Silverside's technology make a difference here? So for all of these four cases, I guess, understanding the vocabulary and the motivation and incentive structure of who you're talking to is great and easy to do, but we don't want to be a chameleon, because we're not just going to fit into who they are and where they are. We have to be ourselves in that space. So the tension on this always is, when do you go into somebody else's territory, and when do you stay on your territory and be disruptive? And I'm going to leave that as a question because I don't have an answer, and Cecil will answer that for us. Or you can ask me later and I'll pontificate. So the third part of branding. So first of all, know who you are. Know fundamentally what you are at the core, because branding will only represent what's true. Second of all, know who you're communicating to and how you can best represent that core to them. These are not rocket. You could probably Wikipedia those points, but still they matter. The third part is you have to deliver. you can be the best brand in the world. You can be the sexiest logo. You can be just the sweetest vocabulary that nails the target message. If you don't follow that up, like you're a flash in the pan and you're gone. Yesterday, and I think probably what contributed to Andrew's sickness, DARPA was visiting Silverside Detectors. They are our funder to date, and they are a godsend. We are a startup, and we have the 3 strikes against us, in that we are selling to the government, which is inherently long sales cycles. We are high capital investment, which no investor ever wants to hear. And we are in a currently relative to very small market space. Those are 3 X's that a VC will shake your hand, say, great, I love the product, I love the company, good luck, and out you go. So for us, it's a godsend to have a government agency that is dying to invest in the development of our technology. So this is a high stakes relationship. They come in, they're quite happy for us that we as a startup got our initial funding from Mass Challenge and had some visibility in the Boston startup space, are invited to speak on panels like this. They're like, yay, good job, we don't care. They are glad that we're working with end users to understand how the Massachusetts National Guard Weapons of Mass Destruction Civil Support Team wants to use our technology, because that'll help us finish something, but great, they don't really care. They're glad we're talking to think tanks, startups, academics, understanding the trajectory of nuclear policy. What they want us to do is deliver on what we talk to them about. So everything else that we're doing to set ourselves up as a company that people want to engage with, people that are interesting, people that are thoughtful, they're like, great, this is all good, but we need working detectors by May. And we have to ship these off to Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and they have to work. We, as a company, beyond that, we have to deliver on what we say we are. We also have to deliver on who we say we are. We are, in some ways, a quirky company, not because we decided we wanted to be quirky, and that's probably not even the best word, but because that's inherently who Andrew and I are, and our mutual kind of co-founding chemistry. We have a streak of black humor, which is absolutely necessary when you're working in the nuclear terrorism space. We don't take ourselves too seriously, which is absolutely necessary when you are a 2-person company and your primary, competitor is Raytheon. An example of this, we were down at DC last May, I guess it was for a startup thing. Basically went down there because they were paying for our trips to DC, and there were a whole bunch of agencies we wanted to talk to. So we're like, sure, we'll go do the startup thing because we actually want to have a free airline ticket and hotel and go talk to the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, DHS, everybody else. At the end of this week, where we did our pitch and it was fine, and we did our quirky scientist security startup thing, we make a lot of friends, people like us. We get to the end of the week, and there's a pitch night where all 64 companies that are there are going to do a 1-minute pitch. We're kind of tired, we don't care anymore. And we decide that we're going to do an interpretive dance to represent how a neutron detector works. Because in 60 seconds, you can go out on the stage and fearmonger, nuclear terrorism, watch out, buy our detectors. Or you can say, DC is sick and tired of security stuff. We're going to invite everybody else in to treat with levity something that we all know and we don't need to reinforce has a lot of gravity, I guess you'd say. So we go out on the stage. All the other companies go. They're, giving their little pitch. One person goes out there. They're all nervous. Andrew and I are joking in the line. We're grabbing drinks from the lobby in the line. We're standing there. We're the first team that goes up, 2 of us, and we're basically Silverside Detectors. We help governments reduce the threat of nuclear terrorism. We're going to show you how this works. And Andrew's plutonium, and plutonium is emitting neutrons in all its directions. I'm a detector. If I'm a small detector, I'm not going to catch that many neutrons. If I'm a big detector, I'm going to catch all the neutrons that come in. 60 seconds later, we're off the stage and people are laughing. Do they remember us? Yeah, they do. And is it the most kind of elegant memory? We don't even really care. Did we brand ourselves that night? Yeah. Was that branding intentional? No. Was that branding kind of inherent to who we are, what we care about, how we represent the problem, and how we represent ourselves? Yeah, it really was. So with that scattershot set of thoughts, I hope that just prompts a lot of questions, and I think I'll pass it over to Cecil.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I would love to have seen that interpretive dance.
It may or may not be online.
I'll look at the YouTube. So thanks, Sarah, for passing the baton, virtual baton. I'm Cecil Hobbs. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for showing up early on a Saturday morning in chilly Boston, or chilly Cambridge, I should say. My background is varied, but generally has skewed towards working in the software industry. And I'll talk a little bit today about some observations I've made along the way that are pertinent to this notion of thinking about your personal brand, but also as anyone who's looking to start a company or who's in the throes of starting a company can also draw parallels to some of these observations, with some of these observations too. But for me, when we all get advice about going to networking events, network your way into a job, network your way into new opportunities, do all this networking, but one of the things I think that's missing from a lot of the advice around networking as it relates to your personal brand is figuring out with each person that you're connecting with, each institution that you're connecting with, what could you do to help that person that you're connecting with. It feels like as students sometimes we don't have a lot of value to give, but we actually have a ton of value to give. Number one, you're connected to one of the greatest institutions in the world, and there are a lot of companies, there are a lot of individuals who are looking for ways to reestablish connections or to establish initial connections to the universities or to the institution that you're attending. And so that's value that you can provide to that person or that organization. Number two, recruiting. I'm working at a company now that's looking for data scientists to help solve a relatively mundane but complex problem around how to find and understand intent among consumers to connect them to companies that are looking to find those consumers who are looking for that particular type of product and service. And so you know friends and colleagues who are looking for access to certain companies or organizations. And so you bring that value to any networking opportunity that you connect with. Last, related to that is the knowledge that you're gaining or the knowledge that you have and the some set of experiences that you have, pulling that together, that as well is a source of value. So when I was a business school student, one of the projects we worked on was with the company now that my girlfriend, who's in the audience, who I'll talk about some related to these points later, was recently looking at to invest in. I looked at this company and did a project with them X number of years ago, we won't say how long ago, when they were a startup idea in a lab. And it was funny because I know their trajectory and I saw their trajectory and I saw the imprint that we made as a student project on that particular company that now is looking to go public. And so it's really, the knowledge that you have here may not seem that valuable as it relates to some specific things that businesses are grappling with, but in fact it is, and you have a lot of insights to bring. So every time you engage with a person or a company or enterprise for networking purposes, think about what value can I bring to that person. And what that does is that sets you up to be distinctive, to be unique. You're that person who, oh, I remember that kid, I remember that lady, I remember that man. They're the person who, every time I interact with them, they're bringing value to the table. And so they're not coming like everyone else, asking for 15 minutes of my time for coffee to talk about themselves, but rather they're coming, and when I walk away, I have something and they have something, so it's a mutual exchange. I think of a guy, I don't know if any of you follow sort of Silicon Valley, but there's this guy out there named Tristan Walker who I admire greatly because of some work that he's done. He's a guy who every networking opportunity he's had, he's set himself apart. Even in the classroom in business school, he went to Stanford, and he was that person who always brought value to the table, brought value to every equation. And as a result, VCs, venture capitalists want to know him. Other startup people want to know him. Aspiring entrepreneurs want to know him. And he's become this sort of central hub of importance. And so as you do that, you become more valuable. The second
aspect of that give value to get values, think about how to become distinctive or more valuable in your field. What's the angle that no one else is looking at with regard to the field that you're studying? So I think about this combination of policy thinking and deep sort of technical expertise and bringing that together. I think about that in the experiences that I've had. I've always taken on either business development or finance roles. I somehow end up being CFO of these companies that I sort of want to not be CFO of, but I end up being that role because I understand operations, I understand the things that business people care about, and I understand the things that the bean counters and the number crunchers care about. And so I can bring that together and speak two different languages so that things that seem like they're at odds with each other actually can be brought together to move a company forward. So that's the number two sort of bit of advice or bit of set of observations around branding and developing your career that I've noticed. Third is, and I'll try to stick to our time, time is your most valuable resource. It's non-renewable. So every day, every month, every week, you're giving your time and deciding how to spend it. We all have sort of financial budgets. A lot of us maybe have financial budgets that we try to stick to. But very few of us think about our time in that same aspect. Unlike money, we can't get back time once it's been spent. And so every choice that we make around who we're spending time with, how we're spending that time, really adds up. And that happens in the startup world. Every month that you spend chasing customer X who may not actually be a good customer or building out the product in this direction that may not actually be valuable is time that could have been used moving you closer to where you want to go. Even as a student, how are you spending your time, and how do we choose to spend our leisure time? It's a simple question of what do you want to do with each day in each year of your life. I look at, and this is the example that I was going to mention earlier with regard to my girlfriend. She does a trimesterly reflection of how have I spent the last third of a year, and have I accomplished the goals that I set out to accomplish, and where do I want to spend the next third of a year. And whatever period of time makes sense, I think that sort of practice, getting to that habit of reflecting, I do it on a daily basis at the end of each workday. I sort of look back and say, okay, what did I actually get done today? What things move me closer to the sort of day-to-day goals, and what things move me closer to that big set of goals that I've got out there? And how do I need to, what can I learn from today and take into tomorrow to change how I've done it? So each day is a little bit of an experiment to see if I can get closer to getting that right, getting that optimal amount of time allocated to the right things, and each day is a reflection to figure that out. So that's number three. And related to that point, we have a lot more time than we think we have. It takes 10,000 hours, as the popular literature now says, to become an expert in the field. That's, if you take 10 hours a day, that's about 3 years. 10 hours a day practiced with the right kind of practice on something makes you an expert in a field. I could find 10 hours in a given day. I could find several hours in a given day even to focus on something and to take it away from something that's not actually worth my expertise. Am I going to be an expert in scandal and how to get away with murder, or am I going to be an expert in something else? And so making those choices and being very conscious about those choices, I think, is incredibly important. And then the last thing is related to the brand of you, which is that we're the sum total of the 5 people we spend the most time with. And so that's really important. And that includes our partners, our colleagues, our friends, our family members, the professional networks that we develop. We're the sum total of the 5 people we spend the most time with. And so that has a lot of implications for how we choose to sort of create the future brand that we want to be. But how do we make ourselves better? I spend as much time as I can trying to surround myself with people who are, I'd like to say, better than I am. And in doing so, one, it keeps me humble, but also, number two, it helps me learn the thing or the things that I don't know. What else don't I know? This is why I'm always asking Marina and her husband Reggie out for brunch, because I know they know a lot of things that I don't know, and I want to have access to that knowledge and those sorts of insights. And so I'd close by encouraging you to think about the 5 people that you're spending the most time with.
Thank you very much. So I guess both of you all actually stuck very well to managing your time, just to speak to that point on timeliness. So right now we would like to open up the floor for questions. So if nobody else has any questions, I actually have a quick question. So Sarah, you mentioned that you went from Mass Challenge to DARPA, and that at the same time it was really hard to convince VCs to actually invest in your company. So how did you actually convince Mass Challenge to really stick on to something that VCs normally don't invest in?
So on the record, so a couple distinctions there. We haven't tried to raise money from VCs because you should always figure out what you're going to fail at and then avoid it. Or no, actually, I take that back. Sometimes we need to strategically fail. That can be really good for our characters and for our brands even. But in that one, it was going to be a waste of time. It was not going to be well managed. And we also, this is another off point. A good friend of mine once told me that as soon as you raise venture capital for a startup, your company becomes the product. Your product is a means for increasing the value of the company. And that right now, our product is neutron detectors that are really low cost and that you can plaster around a city and network, so we actually have a chance of detecting an improvised nuclear device if it's smuggled into a city. We want to keep that our product as long as we possibly can. So that's free. Back to your question though, Mass Challenge didn't invest, they give award money. We convinced Mass Challenge to give us the money. Part of it was just because we have a really splashy concept. Mass Challenge wants to invest in impact, and we convinced them that we have a decent chance of being the team that can have significant impact in a space that really needs impact. I think the other one is credibility. And this comes back to branding representing the truth of who you are. There has to be a track record of big thinking, of really precise articulation to your audience, and then I guess integrity is the word I want to come back to. Integrity is backing up what you say with action. And Mass Challenge picked up on our aspirations to be excellent in articulation, to be excellent in execution, and then absolutely to be excellent in integrity. And they were like, all right, we'll see if these kids can make it happen.
Cool, thank you. Any questions from the audience?
At lunchtime, you mentioned that your team did an interpretive dance to bring out the brand of the neutron detectors. How would you see that in terms of the potential conflict between something that's a very serious issue and this dance that could be maybe interpreted by the audience as the persons who are doing it not being serious? How do you manage that potential conflict?
That's a great question. Choose your context very, very carefully. I would not do an interpretive dance in front of VCs if we were trying to raise money. So part of that is judging what's appropriate or what's just marginally inappropriate, I should say, instead of absolutely inappropriate. Part of that is, and then risk taking. When you're a startup, you are going to do something that other people haven't done. This is one of the fundamental challenges of a startup. We go out and we get advisors who have succeeded in the space we are in. And yet, if everybody else's success in this space were sufficient, then we would have no market. And so people's success is not going to be 100% transferable to what we're doing, because otherwise we wouldn't have a market. So there has to be the risk taking of saying, this hasn't been done in this space before. I'm kind of extrapolating your question. People haven't talked about the technology of the problem in this way. Is it inappropriate to do so, or is this actually an opportunity for differentiation? The interpretive dance, it was an appropriate response in that context. And I think there's also a lot of power in levity. If you think about what Dr. Strangelove or How I Learned to Love the Bomb, that's a really serious movie with a really funny and absolutely ridiculous title and an enterprise there, but it's saying something deep. Sometimes a team that demonstrates enough confidence to treat with levity something that is absolutely serious demonstrates how serious we are about it. So that can actually, I don't think we were that strategic when we did it, but I can retrospectively superimpose that really good strategy onto the dance.
I think you brought up an interesting point in terms of risk reward.
Yeah.
So, and it's particularly relevant to all of the choices that a startup makes around understanding what's the payoff and then what's the downside, and figuring out how far do you want to cap your downside, or how much do you want to cap your downside. So with regard to that, there was probably a subconscious assessment of the situation that said, okay, if this totally bombs, no pun intended.
Exactly. We do that a lot.
No, what happens? What happens here? Do we lose credibility with people who are critical to our success? Do we handicap our ability to raise money in the future? Do we turn off potential customers? In this particular context, it made sense to risk whatever was at risk there relative to the upside, which was being novel, being unique, having a distinctive voice. And so I think about that in the workplace. I think about that sort of risk-reward profile and how I make choices about how to spend my time, about ventures that you want to start, are ventures that you may want to join. And so it's all a risk-reward trade-off, I think.
Yeah, it is. And then one other follow-on comment to that. Timing really matters. We wouldn't have gotten up on a stage and done an interpretive dance on day one of the Startup Festival. We had 5 days, 1 or 2 pitches, a lot of time building relationship with, not the whole audience, but a core of it. So at the end of the week, people are interpreting, no pun intended, that dance, in the context of who they have come to know that we are. It's like in a classroom, on day one, you're not going to ask the most provocative question, most likely. On a first date, you might not crack that borderline offensive joke. But when you have a track record of relationship, then you can start taking more risks.
I had a question. Can you speak to how you created your company's name? Because I think, especially if you're dealing with scalable businesses, your company name will probably be noticed far more quicker than the people behind the company name. So I know you're Silverside Detectors.
Mm-hmm.
What was the process you took coming up with your company name? And can you attach that to the brand of your company and how it associates with your personal brand?
Yeah. Andrew chose the name.
This is valid for both.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew chose the name but when he incorporated as a Delaware C 2 years ago. So this is actually before I came on and joined him. The concept, I think, was just, it's not going to be quite as intentional as I think your question indicates, and most people should be about a company. Silverside is a kind of fish, and when it schools, it's like a large reflective surface area of all these tiny little silver fishes. And our detectors are a really large surface area. Is anybody going to know this? Absolutely not. It just is. I think one thing we did discuss when I joined the team, or when we kind of took what was on paper a company and started to make it a real company, was I think the power of having a non-descriptive company name. Most companies in our space are Radiation Solutions Incorporated, or American Scientific Engineering, or something like that, very descriptive. Having something that is not descriptive, just is, I personally, and Andrew personally, I think really appreciate. There's the classic story is Monster.com. The guy who started that woke up and said, this is a monster idea. I'm going to call it Monster.com. Does it have anything to do with resumes? No. Does that matter? No, actually, it's probably an advantage to it. Right now, we have detectors in the name. Every single person we've talked to about this is like, maybe you should take detectors out, because what happens when you expand into different product or service spaces, we'll come to that eventually. The name and what it communicates and the risk of any change is going to matter a lot more if you have a consumer audience as opposed to a B2B, or for us, is B2G a phrase, business to government? I just coined that, people, right here. It's going to matter more in those contexts. So if you're starting up something that's going to be consumer facing, spend a lot more time on the name than we did.
Yeah, so I've touched a number of companies that have either, both large and small, that have either developed an initial brand, undergone a rebranding, or sort of started a new brand because of a merger. And I'll talk about a little bit. There's some general principles in branding or choosing a name, and a lot of them you can find on internet searches, but some that stand out, I think, relate to who's the end audience. Is this a consumer play, or is this a business and or governmental play? And what does that mean? Because those have two different sort of paths that they take. And another one is it distinctive? And so how do you craft a name that people will remember, and so it'll rise above the fray? A very practical concern is, how do you find a name, and this is really tough, that flummoxes a lot of entrepreneurs, is how do you find a name that you can find a .com for? Because despite what we like to think, .com having a .com address actually means a lot. It conveys a sense of permanence. It conveys a sense of credibility with regard to a business versus, and I haven't looked to see if you guys have a .com.
.co.
.co. Yeah, which is it's tough. I was with the company that had a .net. Great name, Activate Networks. It was about social network analysis and applying that to a lot of spaces. But we had the ActivateNetworks.net, and so every time someone looked us up, they went to either our site or they went to some media consultancy site, and the guy was not going to sell his domain name to us. And so that's a very practical consideration. I think when you think about consumer companies, it's even more important to think hard about, does that name resonate with people? Is it something that they can feel comfortable with? Is it something that they can, and I know there's a session in the afternoon on sort of online branding, and that will probably bleed over into some of my comments, but I worked at a company, the first startup I joined full-time was a company called PanRaven, and that was an ongoing dispute I had with the founder about the company. It had deep meaning, and it meant the raven in his culture he was Norwegian, had significance around sort of tied to the god Odin, and sort of there's a long story behind it, and that's the problem with a consumer brand. If it has a long story that you have to explain in more than a few words, or that you even have to explain, then it's probably not a good brand. And I'd say that in terms of sort of thinking about company branding. There's another consideration, which is, for personal branding, do you use a topic or a name, or do you use your own company name that's worth thinking about as you craft your own company brand? I'm in the camp of use your own name for your own personal brand, because it gives you a lot of flexibility. If you decide to move in a different direction, if you decide to change, if you decide one year, there's this guy, Gary Vaynerchuk, who's, he made his fortune, the first generation of consumer internet businesses, by doing email marketing with this company called thewinelibrary.com. Imagine that, right? People searching for wine. He found a way to connect all the sellers of wines across the country with potential buyers in the local markets very early on using email marketing. He didn't make himself the wine guy. He made himself Gary Vaynerchuk, and now he's known in internet marketing circles, which is his core audience, as Gary Vaynerchuk, who also happened to be the winelibrary.com guy. And so when you think about your personal brand, think about what's going to transcend whatever choice, whatever direction your career takes, whatever direction your expertise takes, whatever direction you want to be known in.
So, actually, can I ask a follow-up question on that? Mm-hmm. So you've both been with companies throughout a number of transitions, I assume, and you've watched them go from having one name, having one idea, and transitioning to a different name. So how do you plan, or can you plan, to keep your brand relevant in 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I think you can. I think so. The brand often, and there's this whole process that marketers will charge you way too much money for to take you through around figuring out what is your brand, what they call a brand identity. There's a brand identity, which is what do we want to stand for, what do we want to evoke, and then that's supported by specific claims to value or elements of delivery that support that brand. So if I say, I'm Cecil Hobbs, I'm a business development executive who rolls up his sleeves and figures out how to fix broken companies and how to accelerate growth in early stage companies. That's sort of my general branding statement. What's backing that up? What's supporting that? What can I point to that I've accomplished along the way? Oh, I helped company X raise $10 million as a Series B when they were stalled out. I helped company Y reposition themselves and turn themselves into, point them to this market. I helped company Z do this. Those are the claims to value or the examples of the claims to value that support that brand. And so as you think about forming a company brand, Coca-Cola has an enduring brand that means something to just about every single person in this room. And they've aligned their brand to this broader identity of sort of, quote unquote, the Americana vision, the vision of Americana. And so they've tried to pivot that brand as they become a global company to mean something broader than that, that's more inclusive of sort of this global, their brand people can tell you where they're going with it, but it's around this global feel-good. So they maintain the name and the logo, but then they've tried to change the supporting arguments, the supporting statements for that brand to encompass the new direction that they're going. So basically, try to find something that's broad enough and flexible enough to allow you to move in different directions, but that the supporting statements for that brand evolve with you as you evolve the brand.
I would also say we are surprisingly consistent as individuals. I remember probably a dozen years ago, I was going through my parents' attic because I had a lot of boxes up there, and I found report cards from 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, something like that. And I'm sitting down reading my report cards, and I tell you, all of those comments could have been written yesterday about me. Really smart, really bright, speaks before she thinks, doesn't always have a lot of patience with people around her, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, yesterday. And so when you translate what Cecil just said about companies into thinking about yourself, it comes back to this integrity. Your brand will continue to be relevant until you die if you are representing who you truly are at the core, and that will grow. I am continually surprised that I can't reinvent myself. I remember I moved to China when I was 24, turned 25 in China. And a year into that, I thought okay, new community. Nobody here knows anything about who I was in high school, who I was in college. And I'm at a small group Bible study in my house, and I say an icebreaker question. Okay, I have a great idea for a question. And before I even say what it is, everybody in the whole circle goes, oh no. And it struck me that that was the exact response that all my friends in college would have had to me being like, I have a great idea, folks. And it struck me that I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't restart. I was older. I was in a different context. I had more responsibility. And the core was the same. So when we know the core, when we know what we want to strengthen about that, when we know what we want to mature out of, that will be lasting and enduring.
Questions from the audience?
And we talk about when it fails miserably, when branding fails, because another company, I forgot the original name of the company, which is maybe partly evidently failed. But basically they tried to brand themselves with a new name, Monday. So they renamed the company Monday, it's a big consultancy.
Price Waterhouse.
It was PwC, okay. So they renamed themselves Monday, and they said that, we'll change the way that people think of Mondays. Because nobody likes Mondays in general. So they did this, and apparently it failed miserably. I don't know how many millions they spent on that, and then they had to change themselves, their names back to PwC. And then maybe some years later they changed the logo, etc. But what are your opinions on that? Is it because they just didn't understand the market properly, they didn't understand themselves properly, or what do you think? Like, if you know the situation.
I'm generally familiar with it, so I wouldn't speak with a ton of authority on that specific case. What I do know of it is that they tried, as you said, they tried to make themselves be known in a completely different way, but they were fighting two different battles, not only trying to change the perception of who they were, but they were trying to change the perception of something that is reasonably fixed in the minds of people. So what Mondays are, what Mondays mean, that was sort of something that probably sounded really good in a conference room around a table with some people who thought they were the brightest minds in branding, and as you said, failed the sniff test, that I like to call it. Is this something when something stood out that you mentioned about how you're trying to convey what your company does? Is it something my grandmother could understand? Is it something that an everyday person gets and connects with, and that was the main failure, is that they were trying to change themselves into something that wasn't who they were. It was fundamentally not aligned to who they really were. They were a stodgy consultancy that came out of a stodgy public accounting firm, and they weren't going to change that, and so they weren't really sort of true, and they ended up getting bought by IBM a few years after that, which was interesting. But so I think that the core message of that is don't try to ice skate uphill, as I like to say. They were trying to ice skate uphill by trying to change the perception of Monday. And two, stay true to your earlier comment, stay true to who you are, and be okay with that. Sort of be okay with, like, I think about various points in my career where I've been in environments and I've tried to conform to what those environments were, and I ended up a very unhappy person in those environments because I wasn't being true to myself. And so when we talk about fit, when you're evaluating companies to join or institutions to join, and this concept of fit comes into play, is this a place I really could feel comfortable being who I am? And for people of color, for people of different genders, there's a little bit of what they call code switching. So we're never going to be like we are with our boys and girls at home in the workplace. That's professional, personal life. But can I be true enough to myself and what matters to me, and sort of how I express myself, and can that be understood in the environment that I'm in, is, I think, a critical part of understanding your personal brand and also figuring out how to translate that into the workplace. So, I know that there are environments that I'm just not going to work well in, and so either I need to find a partner who can help me navigate that environment and sort of shield me from the things that I'm not great at, or I need to find a different environment where I'm going to excel. And so I look at, I just joined a new company, it's not a new company, I just joined a company this January where a lot of technical people, basically it's like 70% developers, handful of analysts, and a couple of what we call suits, people like me who do the business stuff. That's an environment I can excel in because I know how to talk. I get dev people, I get the sort of quant jocks, and the suits I can do without most of the time. And it's okay if I'm basically the only suit in the room. And so I know those are environments I thrive in, and so I seek out those environments more than others. And so I'd encourage you to think about, what environments do you thrive in? What are the characteristics of those environments that really resonate well with the things that you're good at, the things that you're distinctive at? And startup world sounds like it was always going to be a better fit for you than the policy world, because someone who speaks before they think upsets a lot of the tweed coat crowd.
It's a problem.
You have anything to add to that, Sarah?
Just the picture that came to mind is fashion. What's the style of the day? And Monday for a consultancy, that sounds like a really time-limited trend in terms of branding. And think about it in terms of fashion. Some years there are going to be jeans that look great on you. Some years there are going to be jeans that make you look fat, let's be honest. And you have to know, this is going to be an extended and terrible analogy, but you have to know what styles look good on your body and then dress accordingly. And filter what's the current trend according to what works for you. And companies have to do the same.
I actually have a follow-up question. So when thinking about the fact that both of you all have worked with companies that do have overseas reach. I mean, your company is looking to kind of secure the world. And your companies that you've worked for have definitely had overseas reaches. I mean, everything from IBM to pharmaceuticals, those things reach pretty far. So how do you actually go and change your marketing based off of your different audiences?
So think about that in terms of there are a few levels of that I'd like to think, but it's essentially the core of it is sticking to what are the things that we represent, and then how do we translate those in a way so that they're understood in different contexts. And sometimes those contexts are domestic audiences of different types, you know, as Sarah talked about in her examples, and sometimes they're audiences of different ethnic backgrounds or different national backgrounds. And so it's simply learning what's the language that you're speaking in locally and how to translate those things to that language. Everyone cares about security. Everyone cares about peace. Everyone cares about, and so that's a global statement that can be then translated into specific contexts. And so that's how I think about going into different countries. Same thing with IBM. Every business owner, every business executive cares about not having to care about their technology, not having to worry about it, essentially. And so there were things about the IBM brand that translated into different local markets, conveyed that sense of comfort and security. And so that's sort of how we thought about it there.
My previous career, I was consulting with and running microfinance companies across Asia. So I have an interesting take on contextualization. There's a sense in international development, and I would extend it to microfinance, that what works in China, can't work in Sri Lanka because it's fundamentally different culture, and we have to go understand the local norms and the customs in this community development. And yeah, that's true. But over time, working in China, Afghanistan, India, Sri Lanka, Philippines, keep on adding it on, I found that if McDonald's has the same restaurant, the same layout there, and maybe they don't have hamburgers in India, but they have chicken burgers instead, or whatever it is, the consistency matters more than the local demonstration and articulation of that. And I heard over and over and over again from the teams that I worked with, that might work where you're from, but actually here in Colombo, Sri Lanka, that doesn't work here. And I wanted to be like, shut up and stuff your local excuses and just do it, because guess what? It's pretty much the same. So you're branding the color white in China is the color of death. So you might not want to have white flowers on your logo because that's what you bring to a funeral. So there are going to be some local pitfalls there, but for the most part, consistency in representing who you are matters much more than local norms.
So when a person becomes successful, others often ask for advice on how they can copy the success. And I know that you've talked about the fact that as a startup, you go out and you reach out to people that have kind of been there. How do you balance your time in between seeking out that advice versus really trying to customize it to what you need to do and doing what you need to do?
There's no such thing as balance. I feel like we have calculated imbalance. There are going to be seasons, and a season can be a day, a week, a month, a year, where I'm much more focused on networking and getting people excited about what we're doing, asking them for help. Then there are going to be seasons following that or preceding it where I'm just at my desk digging in. Finding people, doing something needs to be driven by a purpose. And so if I'm talking to people and asking for advice, it's because I really need it. If I'm asking for advice because it's something that I should be doing, that's a waste of that person's time and it's not respectful to them, and I'm not going to follow up on it, which makes me look really bad. If I'm doing it out of necessity, that's going to honor the person who's supporting, and that's going to actually make me and the company look great because we're moving on what somebody offered to us.
There's some fundamental things that are important to always do and to always sort of budget time for. And one of those is relationship building, relationship development, relationship maintenance. And so that there's a core of people who I'm seeking to develop and maintain relationships with that I'll always make time for. And then there's sort of that outer circle of sort of optional, I may engage them. And so balancing it is really figuring out priorities.